Hey guys. Tonight we're settling in for a long, very gentle stroll through the medieval world. Go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, let whatever nonsense you dealt with today fade out a bit. This is your time to unwind while I talk about places where no one would have slept well. Medieval history is full of kings, plagues, popes, and questionable fashion choices. But it's also full of spots where living felt like a long punishment nobody signed up for. So tonight we'll drift through those places at a slow, steady pace. Think of it like travel content, but the destinations are awful, and the only souvenirs you'll bring back are mild curiosity and maybe a laugh if you're still awake. We're going to hover around corners of Europe where the cold hurt, the politics hurt, or the general atmosphere just felt like a medieval version of "please let me out." And don't worry, there won't be any drama spikes. Just calm, sleepy narration while we wander through damp alleyways, fading castle walls, and villages that smelled like a goat made ad choices. Let's start with one of the most reliable contenders for terrible medieval living conditions, the lovely, wind-whipped, mud-soaked corner of Northern Europe we call medieval Friesland, or Frisia, depending on which monk bothered to write it down. If medieval Europe had a Most Inconvenient Terrain award, this region would have been on the shortlist every single year. It was wet, it was flat, it flooded whenever it felt like it, and it made people rethink their life decisions even though they technically didn't have any alternative places to live. Frisia sat along the North Sea, which is already a sea with the personality of an annoyed landlord. Storm surges showed up uninvited, rearranged the coastline, tossed livestock around like props, and left the locals rebuilding their homes again and again. These were people who spent half their time either trying not to drown or trying not to freeze. And of course, they're famous for being stubborn and independent, which makes sense. After all, if the land keeps trying to evict you, you eventually get good at ignoring rules. Imagine waking up in a small wooden house balanced on a man-made earthen mound called a terp. You didn't choose the terp life chose you. Terps were little raised islands built to keep homes above sea level during floods. And by above, I mean barely. This was a region where you could step outside, breathe, and wonder if the water was about to take your cow away again. Congratulations, it probably was. The weather wasn't much friendlier. Winters felt like the wind was filing complaints directly against your face. Summers came with mosquitoes bold enough to unionize. And the soil, although technically soil, acted more like soggy despair. If medieval farmers had Yelp, Frisia's rating would have hovered around 2 stars. And even those 2 stars were probably offered by someone who didn't get flooded that month. Daily life here meant working in fields that doubled as swamps, and swamps that doubled as fields. You had livestock that needed rescuing every few weeks, and houses that constantly needed repair because the wood got soggy, then warped, then decided it no longer wanted to be a house. Villages looked like a collection of tired buildings, hoping the weather forgot about them for a day. And yet, the Frisians stayed. They built dikes before dikes were trendy. They fought water with more land, and occasionally with very pointed attitudes. They managed to keep this cycle going for centuries. And yes, it worked about as well as patching a sinking boat with optimism. But that was medieval engineering for you. If it held together long enough for winter to pass, people celebrated. Let's drift our attention south, where life wasn't much better, but for completely different reasons. Tonight, we're gliding over to medieval Florence, land of beautiful art, gorgeous architecture, and politics so aggressive they could make a stone gargoyle pack its bags. Florence today is stunning. Florence then was a place where every family feud felt like a warm-up act for the next one. You know how modern cities have rival sports teams? Florence had rival political factions that occasionally tried to exile each other just to keep things lively. The big rivalry was between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. If you're wondering what they stood for, don't worry, most Florentines weren't entirely sure either. It eventually boiled down to my team good, their team bad, with a sprinkle of papal versus imperial politics. Not exactly a bedtime argument, But people took it seriously. So seriously that entire neighborhoods became known for siding with one faction or the other. Imagine choosing where to live based on whether your street preferred one flavor of government interference over another. If you were unlucky enough to live in Florence during one of its regular political meltdowns, your house could be seized, your family exiled, or your property quietly torched in the night. People woke up wondering if they were still allowed to live in their own city. Not exactly cozy. Even poets got in trouble. Dante, poor guy, learned firsthand that Florence had no chill. One day he was debating philosophy. The next he was exiled forever because the political winds changed direction. Florence also had a talent for diseases. The city welcomed trade and wealth, but it also welcomed waves of plague, like a medieval version of an open-door policy. If you enjoyed narrow streets, overcrowded housing, and sanitation that worked about as well as a bucket with holes, this was your paradise. Otherwise, Florence was basically a gorgeous death trap with great frescoes. But don't worry, we're not staying in Italy too long. Let's float over to medieval Norwich in England. Norwich wasn't the worst place ever, but it had a special talent for smelling like things you hoped you wouldn't smell. Medieval cities had a pattern: too many people, not enough planning, and animals doing whatever they wanted. Norwich followed the trend closely. Picture uneven wooden houses leaning in on each other like they shared secrets, streets that turned into mud rivers whenever it rained, and market squares packed with chickens, goats, fishmongers, and whatever else decided it was market day. The smell was a combination of open drains, dying fish, and people who bathed when the weather felt cooperative, so not often. Living here meant dealing with constant noise from vendors, church bells ringing at questionable hours, and the occasional criminal being paraded around as a warning. It wasn't exciting danger. Just low-level medieval inconvenience, like someone throwing rotten vegetables at you for looking suspiciously French. Still, Norwich was considered one of England's larger towns, which meant people kept moving in thinking it would offer opportunities. It did. Opportunities to get jostled, taxed, or mildly insulted by neighbors with strong opinions. If you managed to survive the fleas, the damp, and the interesting local hygiene, you might eventually call it home. Before we drift too far from England, let's float up toward medieval York, famous for its walls, its cathedral, and its weather, which seemed personally offended by human optimism. York had cold seasons that felt like the sky was punishing you for existing. It also had floods because the rivers occasionally decided to reenact Frisia's favorite hobby. Living in York meant accepting three truths. 1, it rained more often than you'd prefer. 2, the wind didn't respect your cloak or your dignity. 3, the smell near the tannery district could make a grown man reconsider his career. Tanning leather required soaking hides in mixtures you really didn't want to think about while trying to eat. People lived alarmingly close to these places, and their houses absorbed that scent like medieval air freshener gone wrong. Let's float over to another royal disaster of a place, not because of the people, but because of the geography. Say hello to medieval Iceland. Yes, Iceland, the land of volcanoes, ash, eruptions, sheep, and the occasional feud that escalated into a saga. Iceland today is stunning. Iceland then was like living on a dramatic teenager of a volcano. 1 minute calm, the next minute, let me express my feelings with molten rock. Settlers found the island in the 9th century and thought, sure, this seems like a reasonable place. They were wrong, and the weather spent centuries proving it. Winters were long and dark. Summers were short and chilly. Eruptions coated farmland in ash, which wasn't great for crops or morale. People lived in turf houses that stayed warm, but looked like homes built by someone who liked the idea of living inside a mossy loaf of bread. Food could be scarce, animals endured rough winters, fishing was difficult and risky, and isolation meant you had the same 40 people to talk to for your entire life, which probably explains why every disagreement turned into a saga. When you're cold and bored, even minor disputes become epic literature. We'll keep drifting across the map in the next part, exploring more places where medieval life felt like a long, complicated attempt at survival. Let's pause here and continue with Part 2 whenever you're ready. Part 2. The worst places to live in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. Alright, let's settle back in. If you shifted around a bit or grabbed a blanket, good choice. The next stretch of medieval misery is just as calm and mildly disappointing as the last one. Tonight, we're floating into places that were uncomfortable in brand new ways. Not dangerous, not dramatic, just the sort of locations where you would wake up every morning wondering who cursed you with this zip code. Let's drift to medieval Novgorod, tucked deep in what's now Russia. Novgorod was important, wealthy, connected, culturally vibrant, all the nice words you'd expect from a proud city. But if you lived there year-round, you'd notice the charming detail that winter lasted roughly 12 months. All right, maybe not literally, but close enough to feel like a personal attack. Temperatures regularly decided to drop into numbers that make your bones ache just thinking about them. If you've ever tried walking across icy ground while wearing layered wool and hope, that's the Novgorod experience. People lived in wooden houses packed tightly together, trying to keep heat inside with whatever insulation they could find. Usually moss, sometimes mud, occasionally something they didn't name. The city was built along rivers that froze over so solidly you could travel across them. That sounds fun if you're visiting for 3 days. Less fun if you have to do it every winter to get basic supplies. And if you were unlucky enough to be around during one of the famous medieval fires, which happened because wooden buildings plus indoor flames were apparently a lifestyle choice, you learned quickly that living here was a never-ending negotiation with the elements. Novgorod's solution to fire? Rebuild it. Again and again. A bold strategy. But despite all this, the city thrived. Trade was excellent, governance was more collaborative than most of medieval Europe. And still, every winter the wind blasted through town like it wanted everyone to move somewhere warmer. People stayed anyway. That's medieval commitment for you. Let's float farther south for something different. A place where the weather wasn't the problem. The real issue was everything else. Welcome to medieval Paris, which today is romantic and artistic, but in the Middle Ages felt like living inside a crowded pantry that desperately needed cleaning. Paris was dense. Streets were narrow enough that you could reach out of your window and touch the neighbor's house. Which sounds cozy until you realize both households were tossing waste into the same alley. The smell had layers, and none of them were pleasant. Sanitation didn't keep up with population growth. The Seine River carried half the city's waste, and I'm being polite. The water absolutely wasn't something you drank unless you had a strong immune system or a short lifespan expectancy. Markets sold fish, bread, meat, and food items you didn't want to identify too closely. Animals wandered through the streets, sometimes pulling carts, sometimes contributing to the olfactory disaster. The city had charm, sure, cathedrals rising above everything else, scholars debating lofty ideas at the university, but the everyday resident handled crowding, noise, random street performers, the occasional fief, and a constant sense that the ground beneath them wasn't entirely solid. Paris was lively but exhausting, and if you lived near the tanneries or butcher stalls, you probably went noseblind out of sheer survival instinct. Let's drift over to the Mediterranean for a calm glide above medieval Athens, which was not the philosophical paradise you might picture. Classical Athens was long gone by then. Medieval Athens had been passed around by different rulers like a souvenir nobody really wanted to display. The city still had fragments of its ancient glory, but it also had crumbling buildings, limited resources, and a general, we're trying our best, please lower expectations vibe. Most Athenians lived in modest homes that didn't offer much protection from weather or invaders. The city changed hands often enough that residents probably kept their belongings packed just in case someone new showed up demanding taxes or space. It wasn't the worst place ever, but it had this quiet sense of faded importance, like a legendary singer performing in a cheap tavern for the 15th night in a row. Respectable, but tired. All right, let's move to a different kind of uncomfortable. Medieval Cairo. Cairo was massive, wealthy, and influential. But living there came with challenges the average person didn't exactly cheer for. The heat alone made daily chores feel like endurance tests. Dust storms appeared whenever they felt inspired. And the sheer size of the population meant that crowding, noise, and shortages were just part of life. Cairo was famous for its markets, but those markets also meant dense traffic. Not modern traffic, medieval traffic, which meant animals in every direction, vendors calling out, kids darting between stalls, and goods everywhere. The noise was constant, and the smells ranged from delicious spice blends to something is definitely decomposing. Food was good, culture was rich, architecture was impressive. But the gap between wealthy elites and everyone else was so wide it might as well have been a canyon. If you lived in the wrong district, you woke up to cramped homes, loud neighbors, and water that didn't always reach your part of the city. And if the Nile decided to flood too much or too little in a given year, good luck. Stability depended on nature having a cooperative mood. Let's drift back into Europe and visit medieval Prague, which is lovely today, but once had the personality of a place that couldn't decide which empire it wanted to annoy. Prague sat at the crossroads of trade, politics, and occasional chaos. The city grew quickly, sometimes faster than it could handle. Roads were uneven, houses were patched together with whatever was available. And during certain periods, tensions bubbled under the surface. Daily life here involved navigating noisy marketplaces, unpredictable rulers, and the general risk that someone was about to impose a tax you definitely couldn't afford. Plus, winters got cold enough to make fireplaces struggle. And if you lived in one of the cheaper districts, you were probably sharing your home with drafts, smoke, and neighbors who thought walls were suggestions. Let's glide northeast to medieval Krakow, another beautiful city that had its awkward phases. Krakow dealt with fires, lots of fires. Wooden buildings and open flames made destruction a semi-regular event. People rebuilt, sure, but the cycle got old. Combine that with harsh winters, the occasional invasion scare, and crowded living conditions, and you had a place where life stayed interesting in the please stop sense. Still, Krakow had culture, trade, and learning. But if you were poor, you lived in cramped, smoky homes. If you were a merchant, you were always watching the market. And if you lived near the salt mines, you worked in conditions that genuinely counted as medieval suffering. Imagine mining salt for hours on end with tools that barely qualified as tools. Not exactly a dream job. Let's drift now to one of the more infamous regions, medieval Transylvania. And no, not the romantic vampire version, just the regular, chilly, forested region where people lived in small wooden villages and hoped wolves stayed polite. Transylvania was mountainous and beautiful, but also isolated. The winters were long, the forests were dense, the soil was stubborn, and communication with the rest of the world took effort. Villagers often lived in fortified settlements because raiders occasionally passed through. Not dramatic Hollywood raiders, just regular medieval groups looking for supplies. You grew what you could, you raised animals, you stared at the mountains and wondered if spring planned to arrive this century. Life wasn't miserable, just repetitive and quiet, which for some people was fine. For most medieval peasants, though, it meant a daily routine of labor, cold evenings, and houses that creaked like they had opinions. Let's finish this section in medieval Granada, during the final stretch of Muslim rule in Iberia. Granada was stunning, but beauty doesn't automatically make living comfortable. The city was crowded, the economy struggled at times, water systems were impressive but sometimes strained. And residents lived with the constant knowledge that everything could change if the Christian kingdoms pushed farther south. It wasn't constant danger, more like an ever-present tension, the medieval version of a background app draining your battery. People continued their daily routines, farming, trading, working, But life had that subtle stress humming underneath. Part 3. The worst places to live in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. Settle back in. If your pillow shifted or your blanket decided to slip off the bed for no reason, go ahead and fix that. We're continuing our slow journey through medieval places that made daily life feel like an accidental challenge. No plot twists, no excitement, just a gentle parade of locations where people survived out of habit more than enthusiasm. Let's drift next to medieval Bergen, tucked along the coast of Norway. If you like rain, you would have loved Bergen. If you didn't like rain, well, too bad. Bergen had the kind of climate where sunshine felt like a rumor. The clouds lingered year-round, dropping a steady mix of rain, mist, drizzle, and whatever weather exists between drizzle and fog. Imagine waking up and asking, "Is it raining?" The answer was always, sort of. The city was part of the Hanseatic trade network, which meant goods flowed in and out constantly. Money came in too, but that didn't make daily life easier. Merchants lived in wooden houses crammed along the waterfront, many of which were only slightly less flammable than kindling. Fires happened often enough that people didn't even bother acting surprised. Rain didn't stop the fires as much as you'd think, because medieval buildings had a talent for burning on principle. Working in Bergen meant dealing with wet streets, wet clothes, wet floors, and wet everything. Fishing was a major part of the economy, so the smell of drying cod greeted you even when you didn't want it to. People lived close together. Rats lived close to them, and the local hills meant you walked uphill, whether you were going somewhere or returning home. Somehow, both directions felt uphill. Let's drift east, across the Baltic, to medieval Riga, where trade shaped the city, but also brought a steady rotation of people who insisted on having opinions. Riga was growing fast, streets filled with workers, merchants, livestock, and the occasional wandering monk who definitely wasn't minding his own business. It was busy, but not in a fun way, more in a, this place wasn't designed for this many people, but here we are way. Buildings shot up in odd places because planning was optional. Markets clogged narrow roads, and winter added another layer of inconvenience by turning the whole town into a cold, slippery obstacle course. You had wooden walkways, frozen patches, and ice forming on rooftops. Icicles became medieval skydaggers. If they fell, you just hoped you weren't beneath one. People lived in crowded homes with smoky fireplaces, creaking boards, and windows that rattled like they resented being part of the structure. Let's ease a little south into medieval Bavaria, focusing on its smaller rural towns. These villages had farmland, forests, and a general sense that the wider world didn't visit unless it was lost. People lived in timber-framed houses that looked charming today, but smelled deeply fermented back then. Smoke seeped into walls because chimneys weren't as effective as they pretended to be. Cows slept under the same roof sometimes because warmth was precious, and medieval people didn't mind sharing living quarters with livestock when it meant not freezing. Daily life here was repetitive. You woke up, tended the animals, worked the fields, collected wood, and occasionally attended a festival if someone had enough beer to bother hosting one. Winters were cold, summers were humid, and storms rolled across the region with enthusiasm. Floods arrived when they wanted. Crops grew only if nature allowed it. And if disease reached the village, everyone knew immediately because gossip traveled faster than the weather. Let's drift now to medieval Sardinia, which sounds pleasant until you lived there full time. The island had rugged terrain, limited farmland, and communities that clustered in places where water and resources existed. Banditry became a minor tradition in some regions, not because people were dramatic, but because survival pushed them toward creative problem-solving. If you lived inland, you dealt with rocky landscapes and isolation. If you lived near the coast, you worried about ships that weren't always friendly. Houses were simple stone constructions with small windows and fewer comforts than the average cave. People worked long hours under a hot sun. Droughts hit hard. Feuds between families lingered for generations because no one had enough free time to settle disagreements properly. Living here wasn't terrible, but it wasn't convenient. You made do with what you had, hoped rain eventually showed up, and adjusted expectations to whatever the island allowed. Let's float east toward medieval Jerusalem, a city that saw more rulers than any medieval settlement should have. Jerusalem shifted hands repeatedly, which meant residents lived in a constant rotation of new laws, new taxes, new restrictions, and new people insisting they were now in charge. Even during quieter periods, the city struggled with overcrowding, limited resources, and water that didn't always flow where it needed to. Houses were close together, streets twisted around hills, markets spilled over with vendors hoping tourists, pilgrims, or locals would buy something. The smell of spices mixed with the smell of animals and heat. And because the city sat in a contested region, people always had the sense that peace might be temporary. Not dramatic fear, just that low-level anxiety that things could shift at any moment. Living here meant a lot of patience, a lot of shared water, and accepting that stability depended on which ruler felt ambitious that year. Let's drift north again to medieval Edinburgh, Scotland. If you've ever been there in winter, you know the wind has a personality. In medieval times, that personality was even worse. Edinburgh Castle sat on a volcanic rock, which made it impressive, but also meant residents walked uphill constantly. No matter where you lived, somehow the path to your destination involved climbing. Old Town was dense. Houses rose taller and taller as builders tried to fit more people into limited space. The result was towering, narrow structures that leaned like they were tired. Smoke from fireplaces collected in the streets. Sanitation worked when it felt like it, and people dumped waste from upper windows with the enthusiasm of someone trying to speed-run disease transmission. If you survived the smell, the cold, and the charm of living in a stone labyrinth, you might call it home. Let's glide southeast to medieval Buda, which later united with Pest, but at this point stood on its own. Buda was strategic, wealthy, and politically important, but it was also perched on steep hills. Houses clung to slopes, roads twisted awkwardly, and daily life meant climbing, descending, slipping, and occasionally questioning your leg's commitment to the task. The Hungarian kings made Buda their seat, which brought nobles, servants, guards, merchants, and a steady stream of people who needed something. Crowds grew, markets grew with them, and soon the city felt cramped in awkward places. Winters were cold, summers were dusty. The Danube flooded just enough to remind people who actually controlled the landscape. And if you lived in the less wealthy districts, your home probably had drafts that whistled like the house was trying to communicate. Let's float to medieval Seville, warm and colorful, but not always comfortable. Summers reached temperatures that made work feel impossible. Airflow inside homes was limited, unless you could afford a courtyard design. Dust blew in from the countryside. Mosquitoes multiplied near the river. And the city's population density meant noise filtered into every open window. People lived close together, sometimes too close, sharing walls that echoed their neighbors' arguments, music, and cooking. Markets were lively but crowded. Water was valuable. And because the city traded heavily, diseases traveled through with annoying regularity. If you lived anywhere near the port, the smell of fish, tar, and sweat greeted you before sunrise. Seville was beautiful but not gentle on its residents. Let's drift now to one of the more overlooked places, medieval Flanders, especially the textile towns like Bruges or Ghent. These places made fabric for half of Europe, but working conditions weren't exactly inspirational. Looms clacked loudly in workshops that were small, dark, and filled with fibers floating through the air. Workers breathed that in all day. Air quality was basically medieval lung seasoning. The wealth of these towns didn't always reach the people who actually made the cloth. Laborers lived in cramped homes stacked tightly along canals. Floods hit without warning. Winters were chilly and damp. And fire hazards were everywhere because wool, wood, and open flames were not a smart combination. Still, people stayed because the textile trade paid better than farming, even if it came with a side of permanent exhaustion. Let's close this section by floating over to medieval Naples, a city with charm but also unfiltered chaos. Naples sat next to an active volcano, which sent ash drifting in whenever it felt sociable. Streets were busy, neighborhoods were crowded, and everyone lived close to everyone else's problems. Noise echoed between buildings. Smells blended together into an aromatic puzzle you didn't want to solve. And the occasional tremor reminded residents that nature had opinions. Still, life went on. People cooked, traded, sang, argued, and carried on with the confidence of a city that refused to be intimidated by its own geography. But if you lived in one of the cheaper districts, you probably dealt with leaky roofs, loud neighbors, uneven floors, and streets that turned muddy after every rain. Part 4. The worst places to live in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. Let's settle back down. If your room got a little too quiet or your chair made that mysterious noise furniture makes just to remind you it's alive, don't worry about it. We're drifting into more medieval places where living felt like a long, patient sigh. Nothing dramatic, just daily inconvenience stacked gently on top of daily inconvenience. Let's drift over to medieval Constantinople, the famous city where East met West, and everyone insisted on having an opinion about it. The place was wealthy, crowded, and full of life. But if you lived there, especially as an ordinary resident, you learned quickly that fame doesn't automatically mean comfort. Houses were packed close together. Streets wound around each other like they were trying to confuse you on purpose. Noise rolled through the city all day, and the smell of cooking fires, fish markets, incense, and random alley odors blended into something you could identify only as Constantinople's general aroma. Water supply came from massive aqueduct systems, which were engineering marvels, but the distribution inside the city wasn't always consistent. Wealthy families had fountains and courtyards. Poorer families made do with crowded cisterns and public fountains where you waited in lines that never moved. Fires happened often. Crowding made escape difficult. And when politics heated up, which was often, the city became a loud, restless cluster of opinions, rumors, and arguments. Living here was impressive in theory, tiring in practice. Let's drift north to medieval Saxony. Not a single city, but a region full of forests, farmland, and villages that seemed permanently damp. Saxony was fertile, but it also had swamps, fog, and weather that felt indecisive. Homes were timber-framed, often with thatched roofs that leaked whenever the sky felt emotional. Peasants lived side by side with their animals because warmth was limited and practicality always won. You might hear your cow snoring at night. You'd just accept it. Daily routine meant managing fields, making repairs, and trying not to sink your boots into a mud patch pretending to be solid ground. Roads were muddy half the year, frozen the other half. Travel was slow, trade was limited, and when nobles called for taxes or labor, they didn't check if your harvest was good. If you tried to explain your crops failed because of weather, they nodded politely and still took what you owed. Let's drift to medieval Lisbon, long before it became a sunny tourist favorite. Medieval Lisbon was lively but unpredictable. Steep hills shaped the city, which meant walking anywhere involved climbing stairs that seemed built specifically to annoy your legs. Homes stacked along the slopes, leaning into the landscape. Streets were narrow, and because people lived close together, noise carried naturally. You could hear your neighbor cooking, arguing, laughing, singing, and occasionally dropping something heavy for no clear reason. Lisbon's port kept the city busy, but the traffic brought dirt, odors, and insects. Ships came in with goods, sailors, animals, and sometimes diseases hitchhiking without paying fare. Sanitation wasn't modern by any stretch. Waste went down the streets. Water wasn't always clean. And the wind coming off the Atlantic liked to rearrange people's belongings without warning. Still, residents navigated daily life with the resigned confidence of people who had no idea their city would eventually become photogenic. Let's ease east into medieval Sicily, an island with gorgeous coastline, volcanic soil, and enough political instability to make everyone develop patience as a survival skill. Sicily was fertile, but it was also ruled by a long list of outsiders: Normans, Byzantines, Arabs, Germans, Aragonese, all taking turns like the island was some sort of medieval group project nobody coordinated. These constant shifts meant laws changed, taxes changed, expectations changed, and sometimes the entire ruling class changed their minds about what they wanted from you. Meanwhile, daily life continued. People lived in stone houses that stayed cool in summer but felt unfriendly in winter. Roads were rough. Travel between towns meant dealing with hills, dust, and the occasional bandit who treated the countryside like their personal toll booth. Farmers worked long hours, fishermen rose before dawn, and everyone hoped Mount Etna stayed quiet. Let's drift north again to medieval Dublin, which was small but busy. Houses were made with wood and wattle and daub, roofs were thatched, streets were muddy, and livestock wandered freely like they had somewhere important to be. People lived close together in neighborhoods that blended Gaelic, Norse, and English influences. That sounds culturally rich, and it was, but it also meant different communities followed their own customs, which created plenty of opportunities for neighbors to irritate each other in uniquely medieval ways. Weather was damp most of the year. Fires were common. Trade came through the port, which made the city lively but also noisy and crowded. Water wasn't always safe, so ale or beer became a staple. Not for fun, simply because the alternative was bacteria. If you lived in Dublin during the colder months, you learned that keeping warm meant wearing multiple layers and hoping your home didn't develop mysterious drafts. Let's drift over to medieval Vienna, long before it became the elegant capital of music and pastries. Medieval Vienna was a fortified town with uneven streets and a habit of flooding whenever the Danube felt moody. Built-up areas were cramped, work was steady but tiring, and winters came with cold winds that cut through every layer of clothing. Fireplaces helped, but most homes let smoke leak into the room like it was supposed to be part of the decor. Vienna grew steadily, which sounds nice until you remember medieval cities didn't grow in organized ways. Houses appeared wherever builders felt motivated. Streets twisted randomly, markets clogged central squares, and sanitation was basic at best. Waste piled up quickly, rats multiplied. And during warm months, the smell became something you simply ignored. Unless you lived near the tanneries, then you never ignored it. Let's float to medieval Aleppo, a major trading city with caravans arriving from every direction. Aleppo was wealthy, but that didn't make living easy. The heat was intense, dust storms visited often, and water access depended on wells and channels that strained under the pressure of the growing population. Homes had inner courtyards that helped with airflow, but poorer residents didn't always have that luxury. Markets were crowded, animals carried goods through the streets, prices fluctuated constantly, and noise echoed through the city walls. If you lived here, you dealt with heat in summer, cold nights in winter, and the general inconvenience of living in a major transit hub where thousands of people came and went. With so many cultures mixing, the city felt alive and dynamic, but it also felt chaotic, loud, and a little overwhelming. Let's glide back toward Europe and drop into medieval York, located in the north of England. York had history, walls, and more churches than anyone needed. But the city also had a tendency to flood thanks to the river Ouse, which enjoyed overflowing whenever it felt inspired. Streets turned to mud easily, houses were packed close, and buildings leaned at angles that made you question medieval carpentry. Sanitation involved tipping waste into streets and streams. You learned quickly to avoid alleys after rain. Markets filled with livestock and vendors, and winters were long, gray, and cold. If you lived near the Shambles, with its tightly packed butcher shops, you accepted that meat smells were part of life. Not pleasant ones, just unavoidable ones. Let's drift down to medieval Toledo, perched on a hill with stone walls and winding streets. Toledo was beautiful but exhausting. Everything was uphill or downhill. There was no such thing as a flat stroll. Houses were built close enough that you could reach out and shake hands with your neighbor across the alley. Noise bounced between buildings, and strong sunlight reflected off stone walls, heating the city like a medieval oven. Water access involved long walks or hauling jars. Trade brought wealth, sure, but it also brought foot traffic, dust, and prices that rose and fell like they had mood swings. Winters could be surprisingly cold, summers too warm, and the city's political importance meant residents were always dealing with new officials, new taxes, new regulations, or new people insisting Toledo was strategically vital, which it was, just not convenient for the average person trying to live quietly. Let's float farther north to medieval Königsberg, a city built beside lagoons, rivers, and marshy land that felt permanently soggy. Mosquitoes enjoyed life here a little too much. Wooden houses leaned into the humidity, and roads were difficult to maintain. Winters were cold and dark. Summers were humid, and the city's fortifications meant people lived close together, creating crowded neighborhoods where gossip traveled faster than the weather. Trade came through the port, which created jobs, but also noise, smells, and congestion. And because of the city's strategic position, residents lived with that constant medieval tension that someone, somewhere, probably wanted a piece of it. Not terrifying, just inconvenient, like knowing you might need to rebuild something at any moment. Let's drift into one more place for this section, medieval Bratislava, though it wasn't called that yet. It was a modest settlement with growing trade, but daily life came with plenty of tasks and not many comforts. Homes were simple, roads were rough. The Danube provided opportunities, but also created flood concerns. Winters were chilly, and because the town sat along important routes, travelers and merchants constantly passed through. This made the place lively, but also unpredictable. Noise, dust, and occasional disputes were just part of the background. People lived in small homes with limited space. Firewood had to be gathered, stored, and guarded. Floodwaters visited when they wanted, and trade brought both prosperity and problems. If someone's donkeys blocked the road, that was just your day now. Part 5. The worst places to live in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. All right, settle in and let the world fade into a gentle blur as we continue our slow tour of medieval locations that made daily life slightly irritating at best. Remember, nothing dramatic here, just long, quiet stretches of mild discomfort and inconveniences that lingered like a persistent draft. Let's drift first to medieval Antwerp, a city that thrived on trade but wasn't exactly designed for comfort. The city grew rapidly in the 14th and 15th centuries, which meant houses were crammed together along narrow streets and canals. Streets were muddy, cobblestones uneven, and walking through town during rainy days could leave your shoes permanently damp. The canals were beautiful, yes, but also acted as open drains when it rained too much. Waterborne smells mingled with fish markets and livestock, creating an aroma that city dwellers likely ignored out of sheer necessity. Daily life meant navigating crowded marketplaces, hauling goods through narrow streets, and tolerating neighbors you could touch from your window. Fires were a constant threat because tightly packed wooden houses plus open flames made for a predictable outcome. Yet people stayed. Trade paid enough to make life manageable, even if it wasn't comfortable. Let's drift southeast to medieval Salzburg, perched along the Salzach River. Salzburg was famous for salt, which brought wealth, but also smelly, damp streets lined with warehouses. Homes were often timber-framed with thatched or shingle roofs that leaked when rain decided to drop by for an extended visit. Winters were cold and gray, while summers were humid. The river occasionally flooded, reminding residents that nature had final say over their neat little houses. Daily life revolved around harvesting, salt trade, and occasional church services. People lived close together, smoke from fireplaces mingled with river smells, and travel out of the city involved negotiating muddy paths and uneven terrain. Comfort was limited, but survival was entirely possible. Let's float west to medieval Liège in what's now Belgium. This city sat along a river, which was great for trade but bad for flooding. Streets were narrow, houses leaned into each other. Sanitation wasn't high on anyone's priority list, so waste, smells, and pests were natural companions. Markets buzzed with activity, and local politics involved a lot of negotiation between wealthy patricians, guilds, and clergy. Ordinary residents learned to navigate life quietly, tolerating the noise, smell, and occasional disputes over property lines or trade privileges. Now, let's drift north into medieval Stockholm, a city of islands that eventually grew into Sweden's capital. Living here meant dealing with cold, damp weather, cobblestone streets, and timber houses that could warp or rot. Bridges connected neighborhoods, but snow and ice made crossing them risky in winter. Fishing was essential for food, but rivers froze, slowing trade and creating extra work. Residents adapted to isolation, the slow rhythm of seasons, and occasional flooding that reminded them their city floated precariously between land and water. Let's ease south to medieval Naples, revisiting the city for a deeper look. Yes, Naples had beauty. Yes, it sat near Mount Vesuvius. And yes, trade flowed through its ports. But life for ordinary residents involved steep streets, limited water, and homes that leaked when rain arrived. Crowds filled markets, noise echoed through narrow alleys, and ash from the volcano occasionally dusted the city, adding a subtle layer of grit to daily life. Residents handled it with patience and stoicism, continuing their routines as though nothing happened, which for the most part was the only reasonable option. Drifting now to medieval Rothenburg ob der Tauber, a German town preserved beautifully today, but not particularly comfortable back then. Cobblestones, timber houses, and walls meant protection from invaders, but life inside those walls could be damp, cold, and crowded. Streets were narrow, water flowed in open channels or cisterns, fires were a constant worry, and winters were long, dark, and unforgiving. People adapted by layering clothing, burning wood, and tolerating each other's habits more than they wanted to. Let's glide east to medieval Lviv, which was part of various kingdoms over the centuries. Lviv's residents dealt with mixed influences, crowded streets, and unpredictable winters. Houses were timber-framed and prone to drafts. Markets were lively but dense. Travel required navigating uneven roads, and political changes often meant new rules, new taxes, or new local authorities. Daily life required patience, endurance, and the occasional shrug in the face of circumstances you couldn't control. Let's drift south toward medieval Valencia, Spain, a coastal city that combined Mediterranean sun with tightly packed neighborhoods. Heat in summer could be exhausting. Water wasn't always reliable. Streets were narrow and crowded, and homes often lacked ventilation. Markets overflowed with goods, smells, and animals. While the city thrived economically, residents lived with the constant balancing act of urban convenience and discomfort. Dust, noise, and occasional flooding reminded people that living in Valencia required adjustment and acceptance. Next, let's drift north into medieval Strasbourg on the Rhine River. Strasbourg had trade, culture, and religion all concentrated into a small urban area. But residents navigated winding streets, crowded homes, and periodic floods. Houses leaned precariously over alleys. Waste disposal was minimal. Winters were cold, summers were damp and mosquito-filled. Yet the city persisted, and people adapted with ingenuity, community, and patience. Now let's float over to medieval Zaragoza, a Spanish city balancing commerce, politics, and climate. Houses were close together, often timber and mud brick. Streets were crowded, markets noisy, and smells combined from livestock, cooking, and heat. Summers were hot, winters were cooler than expected. Flooding from the Ebro River sometimes disrupted life. Residents coped with resilience and routine, adjusting to challenges quietly and without fanfare. Finally, for this section, let's drift east to medieval Vilnius in Lithuania. Life here involved long winters, damp streets, and wooden homes that struggled against the cold. Markets were busy but often muddy. Roads could be impassable in bad weather. Livestock shared living spaces in smaller homes. And political shifts meant occasional changes in local administration or taxes. Daily life required patience, steady routines, and an ability to ignore minor discomforts that modern people might exaggerate dramatically. Part 6. The worst places to live in medieval times, boring history for sleep. All right, let's sink back into our slow, steady rhythm. If you shifted your pillow or yawned, that's perfect timing. We're continuing our gentle drift across medieval settlements where life was a series of low-level inconveniences rather than outright disasters. Nothing exciting, nothing fast-paced, just the quiet reality of trying to live comfortably when the world wasn't cooperating. Let's float first to medieval Breslau, now known as Wrocław in Poland. This city sat along the Oder River, which was both a blessing and a curse. Waterways allowed trade, but they also flooded occasionally, leaving streets muddy and houses damp. Wooden homes were common, with thatched roofs that leaked when rain decided to visit for an extended stay. Winters were cold and gray. Summers could be surprisingly humid. Markets were busy, streets crowded, and sanitation a low priority. Residents learned quickly that life required resilience, patience, and accepting that your shoes would rarely stay clean. Drifting north, let's explore medieval Gdansk, a bustling port city on the Baltic. Trade brought wealth, yes, but it also meant crowded streets, constant noise, and the smell of ships, fish, and goods mingling together. Wooden houses leaned into each other, so neighbors were never far. Winters were cold, summers were damp, and the constant movement of merchants and sailors meant diseases sometimes spread faster than gossip. Living here wasn't unsafe, just persistently inconvenient. Next, let's float south to medieval Toulouse in southwestern France. Toulouse was fertile, prosperous, and known for its Roman heritage. But ordinary residents dealt with narrow streets, crowded neighborhoods, and the occasional flooding from the Garonne River. Timber-framed houses could be damp, fireplaces smoked into rooms, markets were lively but noisy. Heat in summer combined with limited ventilation made homes stuffy. Life was manageable, just not comfortable. Let's drift east to medieval Innsbruck, perched in the Alps. Gorgeous scenery, yes. But the weather was dramatic, cold, and unpredictable. Roads twisted along mountainsides. Houses were timber-framed and struggled against snow, damp, and frost. Winter isolation meant relying on stored supplies and wood for heat. Daily life involved climbing hills, navigating narrow paths, and accepting that nature set the schedule. Innsbruck residents became accustomed to quiet, repetitive, sometimes monotonous routines that kept them alive but never relaxed. Now we'll float west to medieval Bordeaux in southwestern France along the Garonne. Bordeaux had wine, trade, and riverside markets, but streets were narrow, crowded, and muddy when it rained. Timber homes leaked. Fire hazards were ever present. Summers were humid. Winter chills seeped into houses. Markets overflowed with smells of livestock, fermenting goods, and river water. Residents lived with a constant, low hum of inconvenience. Nothing life-threatening, just persistent and mildly annoying. Drifting north to medieval Hamburg, a major Hanseatic port. Trade made the city prosperous, but daily life was crowded, wet, and noisy. Streets were narrow and lined with timber houses that warped under rain and damp. Waterways overflowed occasionally. Markets were full of merchants, animals, and shoppers. Sanitation lagged behind population growth. Winters were cold, summers humid. Life here required patience, endurance, and the occasional shrug at the unpredictability of rivers, trade, and neighbors. Let's drift east to medieval Rostock, another Hanseatic city. Similar challenges: cold, damp climate, crowded streets, timber houses that leaked and warped, canals doubling as drainage channels, and markets full of activity but also noise, smells, and occasional chaos. Life wasn't dangerous, just persistent in its minor inconveniences. Residents adapted quietly, developing routines that allowed survival without much comfort. Next, let's float south to medieval Perugia in central Italy. Hills, stone houses, narrow streets, and uneven cobblestones made daily life physically demanding. Summers were warm, winters were cold. Water access was limited in some areas, especially for those in poorer neighborhoods. Markets were lively but crowded. Residents learned to manage steep climbs, narrow alleys, and persistent noise while keeping up daily chores. Life required patience and a willingness to accept minor discomforts as the norm. Drifting north to medieval Lübeck, the leading city of the Hanseatic League. Lübeck thrived on trade, which meant merchants, ships, and goods everywhere. Streets were crowded, timber buildings leaned toward each other. Sanitation was basic. Winters were cold, summers humid. Markets were noisy, smells layered, and life demanded endurance. The city's wealth did little to alleviate the everyday inconveniences faced by ordinary residents who weren't wealthy merchants. Next, let's float to medieval Mantua, Italy. The city was beautiful, with canals, palaces, and a growing population. But ordinary citizens dealt with narrow, crowded streets, flooding from canals, and houses that leaked when it rained. Heat and summer made interiors stuffy. Winters brought damp and cold. Markets were busy and noisy. Living in Mantua required patience, adaptation, and acceptance of minor, persistent discomfort. Let's drift west to medieval Avignon, home of the papacy for a brief period. While the popes enjoyed palaces and political influence, ordinary residents lived in crowded streets, timber houses prone to fire, and neighborhoods with limited sanitation. Heat, humidity, and noise made daily life challenging, and flooding from the Rhone River occasionally disrupted routines. Residents adopted through careful planning, tolerance, and resignation. Finally, for this section, let's float east to medieval Nuremberg, Germany. Nuremberg was a wealthy trade center, but ordinary life meant narrow, crowded streets, timber houses that leaked and warped, and marketplaces filled with noise, smells, and animals. Winters were cold, summers humid. Residents coped by layering clothing, enduring the smells, and quietly tolerating daily inconveniences. Nuremberg's citizens managed to survive, even thrive, in a city that demanded constant attention to mundane hazards. Part 7. The Worst Places to Live in Medieval Times. Boring History for Sleep. Let's settle in and let the quiet drift back in. If your blanket slipped or you shifted your pillow, perfect. We're approaching the final stretch of our slow glide across medieval settlements, where daily life required patience, endurance, and a calm acceptance of inconvenience. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just the everyday reality of living in places that weren't designed for comfort. Let's float first to medieval Bruges in Flanders. Today, it's charming, full of canals and tourists, but medieval Bruges had a few minor irritations. The city thrived on trade, which meant canals filled with boats, goods, and occasionally unpleasant smells. Timber houses leaned into each other, narrow streets became crowded with merchants and livestock, and fires were a persistent worry. Winters were cold and damp, summers were humid. Life was manageable but required patience, daily vigilance, and acceptance of minor discomforts. Drifting south to medieval Barcelona, a Mediterranean city bustling with trade and activity. Streets were narrow, timber and stone homes could be crowded and stuffy. Markets overflowed with goods, smells, and animals. Summers were hot, winters were damp. Water access for ordinary residents could be inconsistent, especially in older districts. Life demanded patience, endurance, and quiet resilience. Let's float east to medieval Warsaw, which in the Middle Ages was a smaller town before its later expansion. Streets were muddy, timber homes leaked. Winters were cold, summers humid. Markets and trade brought noise, smells, and occasional crowds. Residents adapted to the rhythm of seasons, daily labor, and minor inconveniences that modern visitors might find charming, if they were brave. drifting northwest to medieval Copenhagen, a coastal city that relied on trade and fishing. Wooden houses, narrow streets, and damp weather made daily life persistent in its challenges. Winters were long and cold. Roads were uneven. Markets were busy and crowded. Residents coped with routine inconveniences and weather that refused to cooperate, while quietly enjoying the small rewards of urban life. Now let's drift south to medieval Siena, Italy. The city was beautiful, with hills, stone streets, and palaces. But ordinary residents dealt with narrow alleys, steep climbs, limited water, and crowded homes. Summers brought heat that made interiors stuffy. Winters brought damp and cold. Markets were bustling but noisy. Life here required patience, endurance, and a calm acceptance of daily nuisances. Drifting east to medieval Kiev, in what is now Ukraine, the city sat along the Dnieper River, which was both a resource and a source of floods. Wooden homes leaked, streets could be muddy, winters were long and harsh. Trade and markets brought life, but also crowds, noise, and smells. Residents adapted quietly to the rhythm of the city, balancing work, family, and minor inconveniences. Let's float west to medieval Lyon, France. The city was economically important, but ordinary residents faced crowded streets, timber homes prone to leaking, and markets that combined the smells of livestock, food, and human activity. Winters were cold, summers humid, sanitation was basic. People coped through routines, layering clothing, and quiet endurance. Drifting northeast to medieval Poznan, Poland. Streets were narrow and muddy, houses were timber-framed and prone to leaks. Winters were long and cold, summers humid. Markets were busy and noisy. Residents lived closely with neighbors and animals alike, enduring the constant minor inconveniences of a growing medieval town. Next, let's float south to medieval Florence, Italy. Famous for art and culture, yes, but ordinary residents dealt with crowded streets, timber and stone homes that leaked, and markets filled with animals and smells. Winters were damp and cold, summers hot and stuffy. Daily life required patience and quiet adaptation to discomfort that wealth and beauty could not completely alleviate. Let's drift northwest to medieval Ghent in Flanders. Ghent thrived on textile trade. Workshops were small, dark, and filled with fibers floating in the air. Timber homes leaked. Streets were muddy. Winters were cold, summers humid. Life required endurance, daily labor, and tolerance for minor discomforts that modern visitors might romanticize. Now, let's drift east to medieval Tallinn, a Baltic city. Cold, damp winters. Crowded streets. Timber homes that warped and leaked. Markets full of merchants, animals, and goods. Roads difficult to traverse in bad weather. Residents adapted with quiet patience, following routines that allowed survival despite persistent inconveniences. Finally, for this section, let's drift south to medieval Valletta, though technically a later medieval settlement. Even early on, life here required endurance. Homes were cramped, water supply limited, streets narrow, heat intense in summer, trade bustling, markets crowded. Residents coped through routine, planning, and quiet adaptation, accepting that convenience was not part of the package. Part 8. The worst places to live in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. All right, let's settle in for the final stretch. Your pillow is positioned, your blanket tucked, and your breathing slow and steady. We're completing our gentle drift across medieval towns and cities, where life was technically possible but rarely convenient. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet endurance of daily living in places that tested patience more than anything else. Let's float first to medieval Bamberg, Germany. The city sat along the Regnitz River and was small but strategically important. Timber homes leaned into each other. Streets twisted unpredictably. Winters were damp and cold. Summers were humid. Markets were crowded and noisy. Water access could be inconsistent. Residents adapted by layering clothing, using fireplaces when possible, and quietly enduring daily nuisances like mud, smells, and close neighbors. Drifting east to medieval Bratislava again, which was small but growing. Streets were uneven, timber homes leaked, winters were cold, summers humid, markets bustling. The Danube sometimes flooded, disrupting travel and trade. Daily life required careful planning, patience, and a steady acceptance that minor discomforts were constant companions. Next, let's float south to medieval Cagliari on the island of Sardinia. Hills, rocky terrain, limited farmland, and occasional isolation made life challenging. Stone homes were simple, with small windows. Summers were hot, winters mild but damp. Banditry occasionally interrupted routines, not dramatically, just enough to remind residents that inconvenience was part of daily life. People coped by working steadily, storing water, and quietly adapting to their environment. Let's drift north to medieval Bergen, Norway, revisiting briefly for perspective. Constant rain, steep hills, and narrow streets made everyday life persistent in its challenges. Timber houses crowded together, often vulnerable to fire. Markets full of fish and trade. Residents accepted dampness, noise, and minor hazards as part of life. Now drifting east to medieval Vilnius, Lithuania. Winters long and harsh. Streets muddy and uneven. Timber homes leaked. Markets crowded. Travel difficult. Residents adapted through routines, layering clothing, and quiet endurance. Life was manageable, just not comfortable. Next, let's float to medieval Lisbon, Portugal. Steep streets, narrow neighborhoods, and inconsistent water access challenged residents. Markets were busy, noisy, and smelled of fish and livestock. Summers hot, winters damp, fire hazards constant. People coped by accepting inconvenience and developing daily routines that allowed survival and occasional small pleasures. Drifting north to medieval Stockholm, Sweden. Timber houses crowded, bridges slippery in winter, streets uneven. Fishing critical, but rivers frozen winter. Cold, damp weather persisted. Residents learned patience, routine, and quiet endurance. Life required adaptation to constant minor discomforts. Next, let's float south to medieval Naples, Italy. Steep streets, narrow homes, occasional ash from Vesuvius, crowded markets. Summers hot, winters damp. Residents endured, adapting to geography, climate, and the constant minor annoyances of urban life. Drifting east to medieval Jerusalem, a city with religious significance, political importance, and crowded streets. Water limited, homes dense, markets bustling. Heat, smells, and constant change in rulers made life persistently inconvenient. Residents coped through routines, careful planning, and quiet adaptation. Now to medieval Edinburgh, Scotland. Cold winds, steep streets, timber and stone homes. Crowded neighborhoods, smoky fireplaces, uneven cobblestones. Residents endured, adapting to the weather, landscape, and noise with patient routines. Finally, let's drift to medieval Rome, the Eternal City. Crowded streets, stone and timber houses, uneven roads, occasional flooding from the Tiber. Markets full of trade, noise, and animals. Winters damp, summers hot. Life was challenging, but manageable through routine, adaptation, and quiet acceptance. The city's grandeur did not eliminate minor discomforts, but residents lived through them daily, calmly and steadily. And there we have it, a slow, steady glide across medieval Europe and beyond, visiting towns and cities that demanded patience, routine, and endurance. No excitement, no drama, just daily life, filled with minor annoyances and persistent inconveniences, navigated quietly by residents across centuries. So, dim the lights, sink into your pillow, and let the quiet rhythm of history drift over you. Streets, timber homes, cobblestones, markets, and rivers now fade into the background. Sleep comes slowly, patiently, just like life in the medieval world itself. Good night.